The Bismarck Sea lay still beneath a pale morning sky on March 3, 1943. The water stretched out like hammered steel, reflecting clouds that drifted without purpose or urgency. It was the kind of morning that made sailors believe the ocean itself had chosen peace at least for a few hours. Rear Admiral Masato Kurosawa stood on the bridge of his flagship, the destroyer Yuki Kazi, watching 16 ships move in formation so precise it could have been choreographed. 8 destroyers formed a protective ring around 8 fully loaded transport vessels. Each ship held its exact position, maintaining speed and spacing with the kind of discipline that only comes from years of training and absolute faith in the system. Kurosawa was 55 years old. His hair had gone silver at the temples, and deep lines framed his eyes from 2 decades of squinting into Pacific sunlight. He had commanded 53 convoy operations over the past 2 years. Every single one had reached its destination. Not one had been lost to American air attack. This morning, his convoy carried the 51st Division, 6,900 soldiers. Boys from Osaka and Sapporo and Kyoto, most of them barely 20 years old. They were packed into the holds of those 8 transports with their rifles and field packs, singing songs to pass the time, writing letters they hoped to mail from Leh. They trusted their officers. They trusted their Navy. They trusted the steel umbrella. That was what the sailors called it, the steel umbrella. 96 anti-aircraft guns spread across 16 ships, all networked through a doctrine that had been refined over hundreds of engagements. The doctrine was simple and proven: American bombers attacked from high altitude or with torpedoes. High-altitude bombs never hit moving targets. Torpedo planes flew slow and straight, easy prey for concentrated fire. The math had worked for 2 years. There was no reason to believe it would fail today. Kurosawa lowered his binoculars and glanced at the men around him. His gunnery officer, Lieutenant Takeshi Morita, was checking readiness reports. His communications officer was monitoring frequencies. His navigator plotted their course to Leh with steady hands. These were professionals, men who knew their boss and did them without hesitation. The admiral allowed himself a small moment of satisfaction. Everything was proceeding according to plan. 480 miles to the south at Eagle Farm Airfield near Brisbane, Australia, a very different kind of morning was unfolding. The hangar smelled of hot metal and machine oil. Welding sparks cascaded in bright orange arcs, bouncing off concrete floors still stained from yesterday's work. The air was thick with the sound of grinding metal and shouted instructions, punctuated by the occasional clang of a dropped wrench or the hiss of acetylene torches. Captain Paul Garrison stood in the center of it all, staring at a B-25 Mitchell bomber that no longer looked like any B-25 that had ever rolled off a production line. The glass nose was gone. In its place, someone had welded steel plates thick enough to stop small arms fire. Where the bombardier station used to be, there was now a framework of reinforced metal, supports all angled forward. And jutting from that framework, like the fangs of some mechanical predator, were 8 Browning M250 caliber machine guns. Paul was 32 years old, lean, and perpetually sunburned, with grease permanently embedded under his fingernails. He had grown up in Detroit, the son of a Ford assembly line worker who had taught him that any machine could be improved if you understood how it worked and weren't afraid to take it apart. Paul had joined the Navy as a pilot in 1940, transferred to the Army Air Force in 1942, and spent the last year flying bombing missions that accomplished almost nothing. 3 weeks ago, he had watched 4 of his aircraft go down. 4 wingmen and their crews, 15 men total. They had been flying a standard attack run against a Japanese convoy near Rabaul. 6 B-25s approaching from 20,000 feet, bombardiers hunched over their Norden sights, trying to calculate wind speed and target movement, while anti-aircraft shells burst around them in black flowers of shrapnel. Every bomb had missed. Paul had watched the splashes rise in neat columns, 200 yards short, 100 yards long, never close enough. And then the Japanese gunners had found their range. He had seen Lieutenant Robert Chen's bomber take a direct hit to the fuel tanks. The plane had simply come apart in midair, scattering debris across 3 miles of ocean. Chen had been 23 years old, a kid from San Francisco, who collected baseball cards and wrote poetry in his spare time. That night, Paul couldn't sleep. He sat in the same hangar staring at a B-25, sketching modifications on a napkin with a stub of pencil the way he always did when working through a problem. And he kept asking himself a question that wouldn't leave him alone. What if we stopped trying to drop bombs from 20,000 feet? What if we just flew straight at them and shot the hell out of them instead? It was a crazy idea. It violated every principle of medium bomber doctrine. The B-25 wasn't designed to be a fighter. It wasn't built for low-level attack. Flying at wave-top height into concentrated anti-aircraft fire was supposed to be suicide. But Paul had spent his childhood watching his father find solutions that engineers said were impossible. He had learned that the difference between crazy and brilliant was usually just whether it worked. So he started sketching. Within a week, he had a design. Within 2 weeks, he had convinced Sergeant Marcus Davis, a welder with 20 years of experience, to help him build it. Within 3 weeks, they had torn apart a B-25 and started putting it back together as something else entirely. Now, standing in front of the finished product, Paul felt something between pride and terror. The modifications were brutal in their simplicity. They had removed everything from the nose section except the pilot's instruments. No bombardier station. No Norden bomb sight. No delicate glass panels that would shatter the first time a bullet came through. Just steel plates welded into a framework that could absorb punishment and 8 machine guns mounted in a configuration that concentrated all their fire into a single cone of destruction. Each gun could fire 850 rounds per minute. 8 guns meant 6,800 rounds per minute, all traveling at 2,900 feet per second. Armor-piercing incendiary ammunition that would burn at 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit on impact. Marcus Davis walked up beside Paul, wiping his hands on a rag that was somehow even dirtier than his hands. "She's ready, Captain," Marcus said. His voice was steady, but Paul could hear the uncertainty underneath. All 8 guns test-fired clean, recoil dampening systems holding. Electrical firing circuits check out. But sir, we've never fired all 8 at once in the air. The vibration could crack the airframe. The weight distribution might make her nose heavy, and flying that low into anti-aircraft fire. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Paul nodded slowly. "I know, Marcus. I know all of it." "Then why are we doing this?" Paul turned to look at him directly. "Because I'm not losing another crew to a bombing run that doesn't work. Because 6,000 Japanese soldiers are about to land at Leh. And if they do, how many American boys are going to die digging them out because somebody has to try something different? And I'd rather die trying than watch my friends die doing the same thing that's already failed." Marcus held his gaze for a moment, then nodded. "Yes, sir." But before Paul could respond, another voice cut through the hangar noise. "Captain Garrison." Paul turned to see General Kenneth Morrison striding across the hangar floor, his uniform somehow still crisp despite the Australian heat. Morrison was the kind of officer who had risen through the ranks by following regulations perfectly and never taking risks that weren't calculated down to the decimal point. He had rejected Paul's modification proposal 3 times. Paul straightened. "General." Morrison stopped in front of the modified B-25, staring at it like it was a museum exhibit of bad decisions. "I thought I made myself clear, Captain. This project was not approved. With respect, sir, you said the official request was denied. You didn't say I couldn't work on it in my spare time. Don't play word games with me, Garrison. You requisitioned welding equipment. You pulled a bomber out of the rotation. You've been using military resources for an unauthorized modification." Paul said nothing. There was nothing to say. Morrison was right. The general walked around the aircraft, slowly examining the gun mounts, the reinforced nose, the ammunition feeds. The silence stretched out. Marcus shifted uncomfortably. Somewhere in the back of the hangar, a tool clattered to the floor. Finally, Morrison stopped in front of Paul again. "How many rounds per minute?" Paul blinked. "Sir, how many rounds per minute can this thing put out?" 6,800, sir. All forward-facing, effective range about 600 yards at combat speed." Morrison's expression didn't change. "And you think you can fly this thing at wave-top height straight into 96 anti-aircraft guns and live long enough to fire? I think if we come in low enough and fast enough, they won't have time to adjust their fire. Their doctrine assumes we're coming from altitude. They train their guns skyward. If we stay below their sight lines until the last moment—" "You'll get 1 pass," Morrison said flatly. "Maybe. Then they'll tear you apart." "1 pass might be all we need, sir." The general was quiet again. Then he said something Paul hadn't expected. "Intelligence reports a Japanese convoy left Rabaul yesterday. 16 ships. 8 destroyers, 8 transports, carrying the 51st Division to reinforce Leh. They'll be passing through the Bismarck Sea tomorrow morning. Paul's heart rate picked up. Sir, Morrison looked at him with an expression that might have been respect or might have been resignation. If you can get 11 more of these things ready by tomorrow, at 0500 I'll authorize the mission. But understand this, Captain. If you're wrong, if this doesn't work, 60 men are going to die, including you. Can you live with that? Paul thought about Robert Chen, about the letters he'd written to Chen's mother, trying to explain why her son had died for a mission that accomplished nothing, about the 14 other men he'd lost in bombing runs that missed their targets. Yes, sir, he said. I can live with that better than I can live with another failed conventional attack. Morrison nodded once. Then you have 6 hours to modify 11 more bombers. After that, you brief your crews. And Captain, if this works, you'll have changed aerial warfare forever. If it doesn't, he didn't finish. He didn't need to. As Morrison walked away, Marcus let out a breath he'd been holding. Sir, did that just happen? Did we just get authorization? Paul was already moving his mind, racing through logistics. 11 more aircraft, 44 more guns to mount, electrical systems to rewire, ammunition to load, crews to brief. Get everyone in here, Paul said. Every welder, every mechanic, every armorer who isn't actively flying a mission. We've got 6 hours to build something nobody thinks is possible. Marcus grinned. Just like Detroit, huh, sir? Just like Detroit. While Paul's crews worked through the night in Australia, another kind of preparation was happening aboard the Yuki Kazi. Admiral Kurosawa stood in his private cabin, holding a letter that had been folded and unfolded so many times the creases were starting to tear. The paper was thin, the ink slightly faded, but the words were as clear as the day they were written. Father, I trust you to protect the men as you protected me. Honor and discipline will see us through. His son Jiro had written that letter 3 days before Pearl Harbor. The boy had been 20 years old, a naval aviator assigned to the carrier Akagi. Jiro had died in the first wave of the attack, shot down by anti-aircraft fire over Ford Island. They had recovered his body from the cockpit, still clutching the stick, still trying to complete his mission. Kurosawa had carried this letter through every convoy operation since then. It was a reminder of why discipline mattered, why following doctrines saved lives, why the old ways worked. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Enter. Vice Admiral Hiroshi Tanaka stepped in holding a folder of intelligence reports. Tanaka was younger than Kurosawa, only 42, and he had a reputation for asking uncomfortable questions. Admiral, I have the latest reconnaissance summaries from Rabaul. Anything concerning? Tanaka hesitated, and that hesitation told Kurosawa everything he needed to know. Speak freely, Tanaka. Well, there are reports of unusual American activity at Port Moresby. Aircraft modifications, extended training exercises involving low-altitude approaches. Kurosawa set down his son's letter carefully. Low altitude, how low? Some observers report aircraft flying below 500 feet, possibly lower. That's suicide. No bomber can survive concentrated anti-aircraft fire at that altitude. I agree, sir, but the reports are consistent across multiple sources. Kurosawa walked to the porthole and looked out at the convoy. 16 ships moving in perfect formation. 96 guns ready to track any threat. 2 years of successful operations. The doctrine had never failed. It's a reconnaissance technique, Kurosawa said. They're testing our response times, trying to gather intelligence. They won't actually attack that way. They'd be destroyed before they could deliver ordnance. With respect, Admiral, the Americans have shown a willingness to try unconventional tactics. Pearl Harbor taught us that they don't always follow our assumptions about what's rational. Kurosawa turned to face him. Pearl Harbor was a carrier strike. This is different. Medium bombers cannot function as fighters. The math doesn't work. The physics doesn't work. They would need to get within 600 yards to be effective, and at that range our gunners would cut them apart in seconds. Tanaka said nothing, but his expression remained troubled. Do you disagree, Vice Admiral? I think, sir, that the Americans have lost many aircraft to our defenses. I think they're frustrated. And I think frustrated enemies sometimes do desperate things. Kurosawa picked up his son's letter again, running his thumb across the worn paper. Honor and discipline, Tanaka. Those are what win wars. Not desperation, not improvisation. The Americans are undisciplined. They attack from where we expect them because they lack the patience to master proper doctrine. That's why we've succeeded for 2 years, and that's why we'll succeed tomorrow." Tanaka bowed slightly. "Yes, Admiral." After Tanaka left, Kurosawa sat down at his desk and wrote in his personal journal something he did most evenings. "The convoy proceeds according to plan. American reconnaissance activity reported but assessed as non-threatening. Our doctrine remains sound. Discipline and preparation will see us through as they always have." He set down his pen and looked at his son's photograph mounted in a small frame beside his maps. "I will bring them home, Jiro," he said quietly, "just as I promised you." Back at Eagle Farm, the hangar had become a factory of controlled chaos. 12 B-25 bombers sat in various stages of modification. Welding teams moved from aircraft to aircraft, their torches creating constellations of orange sparks. Armorers hauled belts of 50 caliber ammunition, each belt holding 400 rounds. Electrical crews rewired firing circuits, testing and retesting every connection. Paul moved through it all like a conductor, checking progress, answering questions, making decisions on the fly. His shirt was soaked with sweat. His eyes were red from lack of sleep, but his hands were steady, and between inspections, he pulled out that same napkin, sketching refinements to the gun mounting angles the way he always worked through problems. At 0300 hours, Marcus found him inspecting the ammunition feeds on the 7th aircraft. "Captain, we're ahead of schedule. 10 aircraft fully modified, 2 more in final stages. We'll have all 12 ready by 0500. Paul nodded, allowing himself a moment of relief. "Good work, Marcus. Make sure every pilot does a systems check before wheels up. I don't want any surprises in the air." "Understood, sir." Marcus paused. "Can I ask you something?" "Go ahead." "Do you really think this is going to work?" Paul stopped what he was doing and looked at him directly. "Honestly, I don't know. I know the math works on paper. I know the test firing showed the guns can handle the recoil. I know that if we can get close enough before they adjust their fire, we can do catastrophic damage. But I won't know if it actually works until we're 30 seconds into the attack run." "That's not very reassuring, sir." Paul smiled grimly. "War isn't supposed to be reassuring, Marcus. It's supposed to be won. And right now, this is our best chance to win." At 0430, Paul gathered the crews for final briefing. 60 men stood in the pre-dawn darkness, their faces lit by the glow of work lights. Pilots, co-pilots, gunners, bombardiers. Some of them were veterans who had flown dozens of missions. Some of them were kids who had been in country for less than a month. All of them knew they were about to attempt something that had never been tried before. Paul stood on a makeshift platform so everyone could see him. He pulled a cigarette from his pocket and lit it, the flame briefly illuminating his face before he took a long drag and began. "Gentlemen, in 30 minutes, we're going to do something the textbooks say is impossible. We're going to fly 250 feet above the ocean. That's lower than the mast of a destroyer. We're going to fly straight at 16 Japanese ships protected by 96 anti-aircraft guns. And we're going to get close enough to see the whites of their eyes before we pull the trigger." He paused, letting that sink in. "Some of us won't come back. That's the reality. But if we do this right, if we trust the aircraft and trust each other, we will end Japan's ability to move supplies through the Bismarck Sea in 15 minutes. Another pause. "So I'm asking you, who are you flying for?" Lieutenant James Carter stood up first. He was 26 years old from Texas, and he'd lost his younger brother at Guadalcanal. "I'm flying for my brother, sir. Marines, died taking Henderson Field." Another pilot stood. "I'm flying for the hospital ship they torpedoed last month. 300 wounded men." One by one they stood, each one naming someone, a brother, a friend, a ship, a reason. Paul listened to every single name. When the last man had spoken, Paul took another drag on his cigarette and said quietly, "Then let's make damn sure they didn't die for nothing. Aircraft commander's final systems checks. We wheels up at 0500. Dismissed." As the crews dispersed to their aircraft, Lieutenant William "Skip" Bennett approached Paul. He was 28 years old, a high school physics teacher from Oregon who had spent 6 weeks perfecting the skip bombing technique they would use today. He was carrying his bombardier's calculations, though on this mission he wouldn't be dropping bombs from altitude. He'd be releasing them at wave-top height. Paul, I want you to know something, Skip said. This is either going to be the most brilliant tactical innovation of the war or the most catastrophic mistake. There's no middle ground. I know. And you're okay with that? Paul looked out at the 12 modified bombers, their 8-gun noses pointed toward a dawn that was just beginning to lighten the eastern sky. No, he said honestly. I'm terrified, but I'm more terrified of doing nothing. Skip nodded and extended his hand. Paul shook it. See you on the other side, Captain. See you on the other side, Skip. At 04:55:12, Pratt and Whitney engines roared to life. The sound echoed across the airfield, a mechanical thunder that rattled windows and shook the ground. Paul climbed into the cockpit of Retribution, the lead aircraft. His hands went through the pre-flight checks, automatically muscle memory taking over, while his mind focused on what was coming. The tower gave clearance. Paul pushed the throttles forward. The runway blurred beneath him. The airframe shuddered as it picked up speed. And then at 120 miles per hour, Retribution lifted into the air. Behind him, 11 more B-25s followed, climbing into the dawn. They banked north, dropping to wave-top height as soon as they cleared the coast. The ocean rushed past below them, close enough that their propellers kicked up spray. The sun was rising ahead of them, turning the water gold. In his cockpit, Paul checked his watch. 480 miles to target. Estimated flight time, 140 minutes. The Japanese convoy wouldn't know they were coming until it was too late. On the bridge of the Yuki Kazi, Admiral Kurosawa was drinking his morning tea. The convoy had maintained perfect formation through the night. The weather was clear. The sea was calm. By this time tomorrow, 6,900 soldiers would be disembarking at Leh, and another successful operation would be recorded in the books. Kurosawa allowed himself a rare moment of satisfaction. Everything was proceeding according to plan. He had no way of knowing that in less than 5 hours his entire understanding of naval warfare would be shattered. He had no way of knowing that a Detroit mechanic with a welding torch had just rewritten the rules. He had no way of knowing that the steel umbrella he trusted with his life was about to be torn apart by a kind of attack that doctrine said was impossible. The Bismarck Sea waited silent and still beneath the rising sun. And somewhere between Australia and that quiet water, 12 bombers flew north with their guns loaded and their crews praying. The greatest 15 minutes in naval aviation history was 4 hours away. The sun climbed higher over the Bismarck Sea, burning away the last traces of morning mist. At 9:35, the lookout on the Yuki Kazi's forward observation post spotted them first. Aircraft high altitude bearing 180 boom. Admiral Kurosawa set down his tea and raised his binoculars. Through the lenses, he could see them clearly. 8 B-17 flying fortresses at approximately 7,000 feet, their silver fuselages catching the morning light. He allowed himself a small smile. This was exactly what doctrine predicted. High-altitude bombing. The Americans always came from altitude. All batteries prepare for high-altitude defense, he ordered. His voice was calm, almost bored. They had done this drill hundreds of times. Across the convoy, 96 anti-aircraft guns elevated skyward. The air filled with the mechanical sound of hydraulics and the metallic clatter of ammunition being loaded. Gun crews settled into their positions with the smooth efficiency of men who had performed this task so many times it had become muscle memory. The flak began almost immediately. Black flowers of shrapnel bloomed in the sky around the B-17 ends, each burst a calculated attempt to bracket the bombers and force them into a killing zone. The sound was constant, a rhythmic thumping that echoed across the water. Kurosawa watched through his binoculars as the B-17s began their bombing run. He could see the bomb bay doors opening, could see the ordnance falling away in dark clusters. The bombs fell for what seemed like an eternity, tumbling through 7,000 feet of empty air. Wind currents caught them. The ships below continued moving. The physics of the situation worked exactly as it always had. Every single bomb missed. Water columns erupted in massive white geysers, some as close as 200 yards, most much farther. Close enough to be impressive, not close enough to matter. Maintain course and speed, Kurosawa ordered. Damage report. No hits, Admiral. All ships report 0 damage. As expected. Kurosawa lowered his binoculars. The Americans waste ordnance on... He never finished the sentence, because at that moment a lookout on the starboard side screamed something that made every man on the bridge freeze. Takei, Takei Hikui. Enemy, enemy, low. Kurosawa spun toward the starboard rail and grabbed his binoculars again, this time pointing them not at the sky but at the horizon. What he saw made his blood turn cold. Skimming across the water at a height that seemed physically impossible, so low their propellers were kicking up spray, a formation of aircraft was racing toward the convoy. Not the familiar silhouette of torpedo bombers, slow and vulnerable. These were medium bombers, B-25s, and they were coming in at a speed and altitude that violated every assumption Kurosawa had ever made about American tactics. And there was something else, something wrong about the nose of the lead aircraft. Through his binoculars, Kurosawa could see it clearly now. Where there should have been glass and a bombardier station, there was only steel. And protruding from that steel nose impossibly were what looked like gun barrels. 8 of them. For one frozen moment, Admiral Kurosawa understood exactly what was about to happen. Understood that every assumption his doctrine was built on had just become obsolete. Understood that the Americans had changed the rules and his men were looking in the wrong direction. He grabbed the communications microphone, his voice cracking with urgency for the first time in his career. All batteries, depress elevation, target low-flying aircraft. All batteries depress. But 96 anti-aircraft guns cannot pivot from maximum elevation to wave-top level in less than 15 seconds. And the American bombers were only 8 seconds away. In the cockpit of retribution, Paul Garrison's world had narrowed to a tunnel of absolute focus. The horizon was a blur. The ocean beneath him was a sheet of hammered steel rushing past at 280 miles per hour. His hands on the controls were steady, but his heart was hammering so hard he could feel it in his throat. Through the windscreen, the Japanese destroyer Yuki Kaze was getting larger with every second. He could see individual sailors on the deck, now could see them scrambling, trying to swing their guns downward, their movements frantic and far too slow. In his headset, Skip Bennett's voice came through calm and precise, counting down distance. 800 yards, 700, 600. Paul's thumb hovered over the firing button. The entire airframe vibrated with the raw power of the twin engines pushed to maximum speed. He could see the faces of the Japanese sailors now. Could see their mouths open in shouts he couldn't hear. 500 yards, 450. The gun crews on the Yuki Kaze were still trying to depress their weapons. Too slow, everything happening too slow. 400 yards, fire. Paul pressed the trigger. The world exploded into sound and fury. 8 Browning M250 caliber machine guns opened fire simultaneously. The noise wasn't like gunfire. It was a continuous roar, a mechanical scream that overwhelmed every other sound. The recoil slammed into Paul's shoulders like a physical blow, driving him back against his seat. The entire cockpit shook with a violence that felt like the airframe was tearing itself apart. But the guns kept firing, 6,800 rounds per minute, each bullet traveling at 2,900 feet per second. Armor-piercing incendiary rounds that ignited on contact, burning at temperatures hot enough to melt steel. The stream of fire was so dense it looked like a solid beam of light connecting retribution to the Yuki Kaze. Tracers painted a line of orange death across the 400 yards of air between them. And where that line touched the destroyer, everything ceased to exist. On the bridge of the Yuki Kaze, Lieutenant Takeshi Morita had exactly 2 seconds to process what was happening. 1 second he saw a flash of silver on the horizon, impossibly low. 2 seconds he heard a sound like nothing he had ever heard before. Not gunfire, but a continuous roar like a circular saw cutting through the air itself. Then the bridge exploded. The windows shattered, first spraying glass inward like 1,000 tiny knives. Morita felt something hot slash across his face and knew distantly that he was bleeding. But there was no time to react because the steel walls of the bridge were disintegrating around him. Armor-piercing rounds punched through the half-inch steel plating as if it were paper. Each impact point became a small sun, 3,000 degrees of burning metal and phosphorus. Control panels erupted in cascades of sparks. The navigation table simply vanished, reduced to splinters and smoke. Men died without knowing they were dying. The communications officer disappeared in a burst of flame. The helmsman's station exploded, shrapnel from the wheel cutting down everyone within 10 feet. Morita saw Admiral Kurosawa thrown backward as the wall beside him disintegrated, saw the chart table overturn, saw fire and smoke and death happening faster than thought. He opened his mouth to scream, but there was no air left to scream with. The firing lasted 8 seconds. 8 seconds during which 400 rounds from each of 8 guns tore through the Yukikaze's superstructure. 8 seconds that killed every officer on the bridge and every gun crew on the forward deck. 8 seconds that ended the career of every man who had believed doctrine would save them. Paul released the trigger as retribution roared over the destroyer so low he could have reached down and touched the shattered mast. The sudden silence after the guns stopped firing was almost as shocking as the noise had been. In the back of the aircraft, Skip Bennett called out clearly, "Bombs away!" 2 500-pound bombs dropped from the belly of retribution. They fell for barely 2 seconds before hitting the water at precisely the angle Skip had calculated. 12 degrees, 220 miles per hour. The physics of surface tension turned the ocean into a solid for one impossible instant. The first bomb skipped. It bounced once, clearing 15 feet of air, then struck the water again. Bounced a second time, then slammed into the hull of the Yukikaze 18 inches below the waterline. The bomb's 5-second fuse had started ticking the moment it left the aircraft. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. The explosion occurred deep inside the destroyer's engine room. 500 pounds of high explosive detonated in a confined space, the blast wave amplified by the steel walls around it. The force of the explosion ripped upward and outward simultaneously, tearing through bulkheads, shattering support beams, rupturing steam lines. The Yukikaze's midsection simply came apart. A geyser of steam and fire erupted from the center of the ship, carrying debris hundreds of feet into the air. The blast severed the keel, the structural spine that held the vessel together. With nothing to support it, the destroyer began breaking in half the bow and stern tilting upward as the middle sank. Men who had survived the strafing run found themselves thrown into the water or crushed as bulkheads collapsed. The ship's boilers superheated and, suddenly exposed to seawater, began a chain reaction of secondary explosions that turned the dying vessel into a cascade of fire and steam. From bomb impact to the ship breaking in half took 90 seconds. Admiral Kurosawa, thrown from the bridge during the strafing run, found himself in the water without remembering how he got there. His ears were ringing. Blood ran into his eyes from a gash on his forehead. Around him, the ocean was a chaos of debris and bodies and burning oil. He turned in the water, treading desperately, and watched his flagship die. The Yukikaze's bow pointed skyward at a 40-degree angle, water pouring from her torn hull. The stern was already gone, dragged under by the weight of the engines. Men were jumping from the rails, their uniforms on fire. Others clung to pieces of wreckage, screaming for help that would not come. In his hands, somehow impossibly, Kurosawa was still clutching his son's letter. The paper was soaked, the ink running, but his fingers had closed around it in the moment of the explosion and had not let go. He stared at it, at the words dissolving into illegibility, and felt something break inside him that had nothing to do with the ship. The letter had promised that honor and discipline would see them through. The letter had been wrong. Behind retribution, 11 more B-25 strafers were already selecting their targets. Lieutenant James Carter, flying the aircraft designated Hellfire, lined up on the transport ship Kyokusei Maru. Through his windscreen, he could see the vessel clearly, a massive cargo ship carrying 1,200 soldiers below decks. The ship was trying to maneuver, trying to present a harder target, but at 8 knots, there was nowhere to go that mattered. Carter's finger found the trigger. 8 guns roared to life. The concentrated fire walked across the Kyokusei Maru's superstructure like a living thing, systematically destroying everything it touched. The bridge exploded in a shower of glass and metal. The forward gun positions simply vanished, their crews killed before they could fire a single shot. Radio antennas snapped and fell. The ship's smokestack ruptured, belching black smoke. Carter held the trigger for 6 seconds, then released 2 skip bombs. Both bombs hit the water at the correct angle. Both skipped twice. Both slammed into the hull at the waterline. The explosions were nearly simultaneous, creating a combined blast that ripped a 40-foot hole in the Kyokusei Maru's port side. Water began flooding into the lower decks at a rate of thousands of gallons per second. Below decks in the troop holds, chaos erupted. Private First Class Hiroshi Nakamura had been writing a letter to his mother when the world went insane. The lights went out instantly. In the sudden darkness, he heard screaming, felt the deck tilt beneath his feet, smelled smoke and burning oil. He scrambled toward the ladder that led to the upper deck, his letter forgotten on the floor behind him. The last line he had written read, Don't worry, the Navy says the Americans can't hit moving ships. I'll be home by summer. Other soldiers were doing the same, all of them trying to reach the hatches at once, creating a desperate crush of bodies in the dark. Hiroshi reached the ladder and began climbing. His hands found the rungs. He pulled himself up, feeling other men pushing below him, climbing over each other in their panic. He was halfway up when the water hit. It came in a rush, a wall of cold seawater pouring down from the ruptured hull above. The force of it knocked men off the ladder, swept them away into the darkness. Hiroshi held on his fingers, locked around the rungs with the strength of pure terror, feeling the water rise around his legs, his waist, his chest. He climbed higher. The water climbed with him. When he reached the hatch at the top of the ladder, he found it jammed. The explosion had warped the metal frame, and the wheel that should have opened it wouldn't turn. Hiroshi pounded on the hatch with his fists, screaming, "Tasukete, Tasukete. Help me, help me." But there was no one on the other side to hear. The deck above was already awash, the Kyokusei Maru listing so severely that anyone who could escape had already done so. The water reached Hiroshi's neck, his chin, his mouth. He took one last breath and tried to force the hatch one more time, but the metal wouldn't move. The water closed over his head. In the darkness, as his lungs burned and his vision began to fade, Hiroshi thought of his mother, of the letter he had been writing, of the promise he had made that he would come home. He was 19 years old. He drowned in the dark, one of 800 men trapped below decks on the Kyokusei Maru, one of 5,700 who would die in the next 15 minutes. The attack had become a cascade of destruction, each bomber selecting its target and executing the same lethal sequence. Strafe, skip, bomb, move to the next target. The transport Nojima Maru took 6 bombs and broke in half her cargo of ammunition, cooking off in a series of secondary explosions that sent debris 1,000 feet into the air. The destroyer Tokitsukaze tried to run, pushing her engines to maximum speed, but was caught by 3 B-25s simultaneously. 24 machine guns fired at once, a concentration of firepower that literally sawed the ship in half. The transport Taimei Maru caught fire, her fuel stores igniting, turning her into a floating inferno. Men jumped from her rails into water that was already burning with spilled oil, and still the bombers came. Commander Koshi Sugino, captain of the destroyer Arashio, made a decision in those chaotic minutes that was either the bravest or most foolish act of his career. He ordered his helmsman to steer directly between the American bombers and the remaining transport ships, deliberately making his vessel a target to shield the others. "All ahead flank," he shouted. "Draw their fire." The Arashio surged forward, black smoke pouring from her stacks as her engines screamed. Gun crews, who had finally managed to depress their weapons to wave-top level, began firing tracer rounds, arcing out toward the incoming bombers. One stream of fire came close to the B-25, flown by Captain Frank Morrison. Close enough that Morrison felt the impacts on his starboard wing, heard the metallic pings of bullets striking aluminum. But close wasn't enough. Morrison and 2 other strafers converged on the Arashio simultaneously, 24 machine guns against 12 anti-aircraft positions. The math was brutally simple. The Arashio's bridge disappeared in the first 2 seconds. Her forward guns were silenced in the next 3. By the time the bombs hit, the destroyer was already a dying ship, her rudder jammed hard to starboard, her engine still driving her forward in a circle she could no longer control. 6 skip bombs struck her hull. The combined force of the explosions lifted the Arashio partially out of the water, then dropped her back down in a cascade of spray and fire. Out of control engines still running, the destroyer carved a wide arc across the water, directly into the path of the transport Nojima Maru. The collision happened at combined speed of nearly 20 knots. The Arashio's bow punched into the transport's midsection with the force of a battering ram. The 2 ships locked together in a tangle of twisted metal, both vessels burning, both taking on water. 800 soldiers on the Nojima Maru found themselves trapped between 2 fires. The destroyer's fuel was burning on one side. The transport's ammunition was cooking off on the other. There was nowhere to go that wasn't flame. Some jumped into the water between the locked ships and were crushed as the vessels ground against each other. Others burned where they stood. A few tried to swim clear, but were caught in the spreading slick of burning oil. Commander Sugino died on his bridge, still standing at his post as fire consumed the Arashio around him. His last order, shouted to a crew that could no longer hear him, was to maintain course. He had wanted to be a hero. He had succeeded only in creating a larger funeral pyre. By 9:58, 13 minutes after Paul Garrison had fired the first shot, the Bismarck Sea had become a vision of hell. 8 transport ships were sinking or burning. 4 destroyers were gone completely. The remaining 4 destroyers, all damaged to varying degrees, were attempting to rescue survivors while trying not to become targets themselves. The water was no longer blue. It was black with oil, red with blood, white with steam from ruptured boilers. Bodies floated everywhere, some still moving, most not. Debris covered the surface like a grotesque blanket. And then the B-25s came back. The orders from General Kenny had been explicit. Ensure no reinforcements reach Leh. That meant no survivors who could be rescued and transported forward. The strafers made a second pass this time, targeting lifeboats, rafts, and clusters of swimmers. The guns fired in short bursts, conserving ammunition, but still devastating in their effect. Australian Beaufighter pilot Lieutenant Owen Fletcher, flying escort, watched it happen and felt his stomach turn. He had signed up to fight soldiers, not to strafe men in the water. But he had his orders. He saw a Japanese sailor on a piece of wreckage, not swimming, not calling for help, just raising one hand in what might have been a wave. Not a plea, not surrender, just acknowledgement. One man to another across the unbridgeable gulf of war. Fletcher's finger tightened on his trigger. The cannon fire stitched across the water, and the sailor disappeared. That night, Owen Fletcher would lie awake in his bunk, staring at the ceiling, seeing that raised hand over and over. He would see it for the rest of his life, in quiet moments when his mind wandered. He would never speak of it to anyone, but he would never forget. At 10:02, 15 minutes after the first shot had been fired, the attack was over. The B-25s and their escorts turned south, climbing away from the carnage, their guns empty, their bomb bays clear. Behind them, the Bismarck Sea burned. Paul Garrison flew retribution in silence, his hands steady on the controls, but his mind racing. In the seat behind him, Skip Bennett was quiet, staring out the window at the smoke columns rising from the water behind them. Over the radio, voices crackled with damage reports. "Carter here. Starboard engine hit, losing oil pressure. Can make it back if we climb to conserve fuel." Morrison reporting. "Hydraulics damage, controls sluggish. Need priority landing." Hayes here. "Tail gunner wounded. Requesting medical on the ground." And then quietly, almost lost in the static, "Baker's not responding. Anyone got visual on Vengeance?" Silence on the radio. Paul closed his eyes briefly, then keyed his microphone. "Negative visual on Vengeance. All aircraft sound off." 11 voices responded. Vengeance with her crew of 5 was gone, shot down somewhere in those 15 minutes of chaos. 5 men who would not be coming home. Paul thought of their faces. Lieutenant David Baker, the pilot who collected jazz records. Sergeant Tom Williams, the engineer who had a wife and baby daughter in Ohio. Corporal James Martinez, the bombardier. Sergeant Robert Davidson, the tail gunner. Private Michael Chen, the waist gunner. He had promised them this would work. He had been right about the tactic. He had been wrong about the cost. In the water below, Admiral Kurosawa clung to a piece of debris and watched his world burn. Around him, men were dying. Some drowned in the oil-thick water. Some succumbed to their wounds. Some simply gave up, letting go of whatever they were holding and slipping beneath the surface. The destroyers Eisashio and Yukikaze were attempting rescue operations, but there were too many men in the water and not enough boats. For every man pulled aboard, 3 more were left behind. Kurosawa looked at the letter in his hand one more time. The ink had run completely now, leaving only pale ghosts of words on disintegrating paper. "Honor and discipline will see us through." But they hadn't. His son had been wrong. Or perhaps the world had changed, and the old truths no longer held. The Americans had not fought with honor. They had fought with innovation. They had not followed doctrine. They had rewritten it. And in 15 minutes, they had destroyed everything Kurosawa had believed about naval warfare. A rescue boat from the Eisashio reached him. Hands grabbed him, pulled him from the water. He collapsed on the wooden planks, coughing seawater, his body shaking from shock and cold. Someone asked if he was injured. He didn't answer. He just stared at the pieces of wet paper in his hand, the last remnants of his son's letter, and felt something fundamental break inside him. The war had changed, and he had not changed with it. That more than the death of his ships or the loss of his men, was the thought that would haunt Admiral Masato Kurosawa for the rest of his life. The smoke from the Bismarck Sea was visible from over 50 miles away. At Rabaul Naval Base, the radio operator monitoring convoy frequencies had been trying to raise the Yukikaze for 20 minutes. All he got was static and the occasional fragment of a distress call, voices screaming in Japanese about fire and sinking ships before the signal cut out entirely. When Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto walked into the communications room at 1100 hours, the young operator stood so quickly he nearly knocked over his chair. "Admiral, we have lost contact with Convoy 18. Last transmission reported aircraft attack, multiple ships hit. No further communication for the past 40 minutes. Yamamoto, at 60 years old, had the kind of face that revealed nothing. He had planned Pearl Harbor. He had commanded the greatest naval victory in Japanese history. He had also predicted that Japan would win victories for 6 months to a year, after which America's industrial might would overwhelm them. It had been 16 months since Pearl Harbor. "Show me the last known position," he said quietly. The operator pointed to the map. Yamamoto studied it, his expression unchanged, but something in his eyes shifted. "Send reconnaissance aircraft immediately. I want a full damage assessment within 2 hours." "Yes, Admiral." Yamamoto walked to his office and closed the door. He stood at the window, looking out at the harbor where ships were being loaded for the next convoy, the next operation, the endless attempt to hold a territory that was so slowly slipping from Japan's grasp. On his desk was a decoded American transmission they had intercepted 2 days ago. It mentioned modifications to B-25 bombers, low-altitude attack training. His intelligence officers had dismissed it as misinformation or experimental testing that would never be used in actual combat. Yamamoto picked up the report and read it again. Then he set it down very carefully and said to the empty room, "If this is true, we no longer control the sea." The reconnaissance report arrived at 1300 hours. Yamamoto read it 3 times, his face expressionless, while his staff stood in uncomfortable silence. Total losses: 8 transport vessels, 4 destroyers. Estimated casualties: 5,700. Survivors approximately 1,200, many wounded. Cause: low-level attack by modified American bombers, 96 forward-facing machine guns. Total skip bombing technique. Duration of attack approximately 15 minutes. He set the report down. "Gentlemen," he said quietly, "we have just witnessed the end of an era. For 2 years, we have relied on doctrine that assumed the enemy would fight according to predictable patterns. High-altitude bombing, torpedo runs, tactics we could defend against because we understood them." He gestured to the report. "The Americans have stopped following our assumptions. They have created a weapon we never anticipated, using a tactic we deemed impossible. And they have done it with such devastating efficiency that an entire division has been lost in less time than it takes to eat breakfast." Vice Admiral Matome Ugaki, his chief of staff, spoke carefully. "Admiral, perhaps this was an isolated incident. Experimental tactics that cannot be replicated on a larger scale." Yamamoto's laugh was bitter and short. "You still do not understand. This is not about one attack. This is about what the attack represents. The Americans have proven that innovation defeats tradition, that flexibility defeats doctrine, that they can adapt faster than we can respond." He walked to the window again. "I have said before that we awakened a sleeping giant. Now that giant is showing us exactly what American industrial power and creative thinking can accomplish. They took a medium bomber, a wrench, and a welder and created a weapon that renders our convoy system obsolete." "What are your orders, Admiral?" Yamamoto was silent for a long moment. "All convoy operations are hereby suspended during daylight hours. Future supply runs will be conducted at night, only using smaller vessels and submarines. This will reduce our transport capacity by 70%, but it is the only way to avoid what happened today." The staff exchanged glances. A 70% reduction in supplies meant every garrison in the Pacific would begin starving within weeks. "And the troops already deployed?" Ugaki asked. "They will have to make do with what they have, because we can no longer guarantee we can resupply them." That night, Yamamoto wrote in his private journal something he rarely did anymore. "Today we lost 16 ships, but the true loss is far greater. We have lost the confidence that our way of fighting can prevail. The Americans do not fight with honor or discipline. They fight with whatever works. And in war, that is the only honor that matters. We are samurai fighting men with machine guns. And I fear we are learning this lesson too late. 480 miles south at Port Moresby, a very different scene was unfolding. Paul Garrison climbed out of Retribution's cockpit at 11:15. His flight suit was soaked with sweat. His hands were shaking. He had been airborne for 6 hours, the last 15 minutes of which had felt like 15 lifetimes. Sergeant Marcus Davis was the first to reach him. Captain, how many ships? Paul looked at him with eyes that seemed to be seeing something very far away. All of them. All? Sir, you mean 16 ships, Marcus, 8 transports, 8 destroyers, 15 minutes. The hangar erupted in cheers. Men who had been waiting for hours wondering if the crazy gamble had worked suddenly realized they had just witnessed history. Mechanics and armorers and ground crew all shouting, slapping each other on the back, the tension of the morning releasing in a wave of jubilation. But Paul didn't join them. He walked past Marcus, past the celebrating crews toward the debriefing tent. His feet felt heavy. His chest felt hollow. Marcus caught up to him. Sir, we won. This is the biggest victory of the Pacific campaign. You should be... Paul stopped and turned to face him. Up close, Marcus could see the exhaustion in his eyes, the lines around his mouth that hadn't been there yesterday. We also lost Baker and his entire crew. Baker, Williams, Martinez, Davidson, Chen. 5 men who trusted me when I said this would work. 5 men who aren't coming home. Marcus started to respond, but Paul wasn't finished. I told him it was safe. I told him the math checked out. I told him we'd get in and get out before the Japanese could react. I was wrong. Baker's aircraft took a direct hit 3 minutes into the attack. I saw it explode, saw it hit the water. There were no parachutes. Sir, you saved thousands of lives, American lives. If that convoy had reached Leh, I know the math, Marcus. I know we traded 5 for thousands. But that doesn't make it easier to write 5 letters to 5 families explaining why their sons and husbands aren't coming back. He walked away before Marcus could respond. General Kenneth Morrison found Paul an hour later sitting alone in the mess tent with a warm bottle of Coca-Cola that he hadn't opened. Morrison sat down across from him without asking permission. For a while, neither man spoke. Finally, Morrison said, I read the preliminary reports. 16 ships, minimal American losses. Captain, you just changed naval warfare. I killed 5 of my own men. War kills men, Captain. You gave them a fighting chance. More importantly, you gave thousands of other men a fighting chance they wouldn't have had otherwise. Do you know how many American soldiers would have died if 6,900 Japanese troops had landed at Leh 10,020? How many more aircraft would we have lost trying to dislodge them? Paul said nothing. Morrison leaned forward. I'm going to tell you something I learned in the last war. The men who lead, the men who innovate, the men who change how we fight, they carry a weight the others don't. Because they make the decisions that get people killed. But they also make the decisions that save people. And you have to learn to live with both. He pushed the Coca-Cola across the table. You know what that represents? It's not just a drink. It's the product of someone who figured out how to carbonate water, someone who built the factory, someone who shipped it 3,000 miles to this godforsaken place. That's America, Captain. We don't just fight with guns, we fight with ideas, with the belief that anyone, even a mechanic from Detroit, can change the world. Morrison stood up. Tomorrow I'm ordering 500 more strafers to be built. By the end of the year, they'll be hunting Japanese ships across the entire Pacific because of what you did today, because you refused to accept that the old way was the only way. He paused at the tent entrance. The men you lost today, their names will be remembered alongside yours, because they died proving that American innovation wins wars. Don't dishonor their sacrifice by drowning in guilt. After Morrison left, Paul finally opened the Coca-Cola. It was warm and flat, but it tasted like home. Like the Ford plant where his father had worked. Like the American belief that any problem could be solved if you were willing to think differently. He raised the bottle in a silent toast to 5 men who would never drink another Coke. Then he drank it down and went to write the letters. 3 days later, at a military hospital in Papua New Guinea, Admiral Masato Kurosawa woke up for the first time since being pulled from the water. His head was bandaged. His left arm was in a cast. The doctors told him he had suffered a concussion, 3 broken ribs, and burns on his hands and face. They told him he was lucky to be alive. Kurosawa did not feel lucky. Vice Admiral Hiroshi Tanaka was sitting beside his bed. When Kurosawa's eyes opened, Tanaka stood and bowed. "Admiral, it is good to see you awake." Kurosawa's voice was rough. "The convoy," Tanaka's expression told him everything before the words came. "Total loss, Admiral. All 8 transports sunk, 4 destroyers lost, including Yukikaze, 4 destroyers heavily damaged. Of the 6,900 soldiers and sailors, approximately 1,200 survived." Kurosawa closed his eyes. "And it was the low-flying aircraft, the ones you warned me about." "Yes, Admiral. Modified B-25 bombers. 80 forward-facing machine guns per aircraft. They attacked at wave-top height and used skip bombing to hit below the waterline. Our gun crews never had time to adjust their aim." "How long did the attack last?" 15 minutes. 15 minutes. Kurosawa had commanded operations that lasted days, weeks. He had planned logistics for months-long campaigns. And in 15 minutes, everything had been destroyed. "I have been reassigned," Kurosawa said quietly. It wasn't a question. "You are being recalled to Tokyo for medical treatment. After your recovery, you will be assigned to a training command position." A desk job. The Navy's polite way of saying his career was over. Kurosawa looked at his hands. The burns were bandaged, but he could still feel the ghost sensation of his son's letter, that piece of paper he had clung to even as his ship sank. "Tanaka, do you know what I learned out there in the water?" "No, Admiral. That everything we believed was wrong, not incorrect, not imperfect. Wrong. The Americans did not fight our way. They created a new way. And we were so confident in our doctrine that we never imagined they could." He looked at Tanaka directly. "You tried to warn me. I dismissed it because it didn't fit my understanding of how war should be fought. That arrogance killed 5,000 men." "Admiral, you followed established procedure. No one could have predicted." "Someone did predict it. The Americans predicted it when they built those aircraft. They looked at our doctrine and found the weakness. They adapted. We did not." Kurosawa lay back on his pillow, suddenly exhausted. "The war has changed, Tanaka, and Japan has not changed with it. That is why we will lose." Tanaka said nothing, but in his heart he knew Kurosawa was right. Within 2 weeks, the impact of the Bismarck Sea rippled across the Pacific theater. At North American aviation plants and California production lines were retooled. The 8-gun modification became standard on new B-25 models. By the end of March, 50 strafers were operational. By June, 200. By December, over 500. Japanese shipping losses skyrocketed. The Tokyo Express, the night-running supply missions that replaced daylight convoys, could only carry a fraction of what was needed. Garrisons across New Guinea and the Solomon Islands began running out of food, medicine, ammunition. Soldiers who had marched into battle with confidence began dying of malaria and starvation. Not because they were defeated in combat, but because the ships that should have supplied them were at the bottom of the Pacific. The B-25 Strafer became a legend. Pilots painted shark mouths on the noses, gave their aircraft names like Retribution and Hellfire and Savage. They flew at wave-top height, targeting anything that floated, and by the end of 1943, Japanese merchant shipping had been reduced by 60%. But the true impact was psychological. Japanese naval officers began refusing convoy escort duty. Sailors mutinied rather than board transports. The iron umbrella that had protected Japan's supply lines for 2 years had been shattered by 8 machine guns, and a Detroit mechanic who refused to accept that high-altitude bombing was the only option. Admiral Yamamoto saw it all unfolding exactly as he had feared. On April 18, 1943, just over 6 weeks after the Bismarck Sea, Yamamoto was flying to inspect troops at Bougainville. American intelligence had broken Japanese codes and knew his exact flight path. 16 P-38 Lightning fighters intercepted his aircraft and shot it down over the jungle. Yamamoto died at 61, still believing that Japan could win if they adapted quickly enough. But by then, adaptation was too late. The man who had once said he feared awakening a sleeping giant had been right. And that giant was now fully awake, armed with innovation and industrial might that Japan could not match. In 1957, 14 years after the Bismarck Sea, Paul Garrison died in a plane crash while testing a prototype cargo aircraft in the Philippines. He was 56 years old. At his home in San Diego, investigators found a sealed envelope on his desk. It was addressed to whoever found it, dated 1955, written in Paul's increasingly shaky handwriting as age and old injuries took their toll. The letter read, "To whoever finds this, I built the B-25 Strafer to save my friends. After watching 4 aircraft and 15 men go down because high-altitude bombing didn't work, I wanted to give us a fighting chance. I never imagined it would become what it became. 500 aircraft, thousands of ships sunk, tens of thousands of enemy soldiers killed. I don't regret what I did. That convoy was carrying troops to kill Americans. I would do it again. But I can't forget. Every night since March 3rd, 1943, I hear the guns. I see the water burning. I see hands reaching up from the oil. Innovation is a double-edged blade. It saves the people you love. It kills people you'll never know. I hope the men who build the next weapon understand that. Because if they don't, we'll just keep building better ways to destroy each other." Paul Garrison. The letter was donated to the National Air and Space Museum, where it sits today in a climate-controlled archive, a reminder that every innovation in warfare carries a cost that cannot be calculated in tactical reports. In 1968, 25 years after the battle, an American military historian named Dr. Robert Henderson traveled to Kyoto, Japan to interview Admiral Kurosawa. Kurosawa was 80 years old, living in a traditional home overlooking the ocean. His hair was white, his hands marked with the scars from burns that had never fully healed. But his mind was sharp, and when Henderson asked about the Bismarck Sea, Kurosawa spoke for 3 hours without stopping. "I lost 16 ships that day," Kurosawa said. "But what I truly lost was faith in the old way of fighting. The Americans did not defeat me with superior discipline or training. They defeated me with superior thinking. They looked at the problem of attacking ships and refused to accept that the traditional methods were the only option. I was a dinosaur commanding other dinosaurs, and the meteor had already struck. We just hadn't realized we were extinct yet." Henderson asked, "If you could go back, what would you do differently?" Kurosawa smiled sadly. "I would listen to the warning. Vice Admiral Tanaka tried to tell me the Americans were training for low-altitude attacks. I dismissed it because it didn't fit my understanding of how war should be fought. I would believe that the impossible was possible. Because in war, the side that adapts fastest wins, not the side with the most honor or the best tradition, the side that changes." He paused, looking out at the ocean. "Your Captain Garrison understood that. He saw a problem and fixed it. That is the American way, I think. Bottom-up innovation, not waiting for orders from above. That is why you won the war, and why we lost." Kurosawa died in 1971 at the age of 83, still looking out at the sea that had taken so much from him. In 1985, 42 years after the battle, a reunion was held at Pearl Harbor. Veterans from both sides of the Pacific War gathered to remember and reconcile. Among them was Sergeant Michael Torres, former tail gunner on Lieutenant Carter's I-25, now 68 years old and gray-haired but still standing straight. Also present was Petty Officer Kenji Watanabe, one of the 1,200 Japanese survivors from the transport Taimei Maru. Watanabe was 72, walking with a cane from injuries suffered when his ship sank. They met by chance at a memorial service, 2 old men among hundreds wearing their old uniforms that no longer fit quite right. Watanabe approached Torres hesitantly, holding a photograph. Through a translator, he explained that the photo showed his friend, Private Hiroshi Nakamura, who had drowned below decks on the Kyokusei Maru. 19 years old, never made it home. Torres listened, then slowly pulled out his own photograph. 5 men standing in front of a B-25. The crew of Vengeance shot down during the attack. He pointed to each face, naming them: Baker, Williams, Martinez, Davidson, Chen. Brothers in arms who never came home either. The 2 old men stood in silence, each holding their photographs of the dead. Then Watanabe said in broken English, "War make us enemy, time make us same." Torres nodded, tears running down his weathered face. They shook hands as 2 men who had tried to kill each other 42 years ago, now united by the simple fact that they had both survived when so many had not. Later, Torres would tell a reporter, "I spent 40 years hating the Japanese for what they did at Pearl Harbor. Then I met Kenji and realized he was just a kid following orders same as me. We were both pawns in a game neither of us chose to play. The real enemy wasn't him or me. It was the war itself. Today in 2025, the wrecks of the Bismarck Sea still rest 300 feet below the surface. The Yukikaze broken in half, her guns silent and covered in coral. The Kyokusei Maru her holds still containing the remains of soldiers who never escaped. The Arashio and Nojima Maru locked together in their final embrace, becoming artificial reefs where fish swim through what used to be corridors and compartments. Divers occasionally visit the wrecks, photographing the holes punched through steel by 50 caliber bullets, the twisted metal from skip bomb explosions, the artifacts of a battle that lasted 15 minutes but changed warfare forever. In 2019, a team of marine archaeologists discovered something remarkable in the wreckage of the Kyokusei Maru, a waterproof container somehow still sealed after 76 years. Inside was a letter written in Japanese dated March 2nd, 1943. Dear Mother, we are sailing to New Guinea tomorrow. The officers say it is safe. The American bombers cannot hit moving ships. I will be home by summer. Please do not worry. Your son Hiroshi. The letter was donated to a museum in Tokyo where it sits alongside Admiral Kurosawa's personal journal and photographs from the battle. A reminder that war is not just about tactics and strategy. It is about 19-year-old boys who promised their mothers they would come home, and 55-year-old admirals who believed doctrine would save them, and 32-year-old mechanics who changed history with a wrench and a welding torch. At the National Museum of the Pacific War in Texas, a B-25 Strafer hangs from the ceiling. 8 machine guns protrude from its nose, preserved exactly as they were in 1943. A plaque beneath it reads, B-25J, Mitchell Strafer, developed by Captain Paul Garrison, 1943, used in the Battle of the Bismarck Sea, March 3, 1943. Reached 16 Japanese ships destroyed in 15 minutes. Significance demonstrated that tactical innovation could overcome established doctrine, changing naval warfare permanently. Every year, thousands of visitors, many of them children, stand beneath that aircraft and look up at those 8 guns. And every year, docents tell them the story of how a Detroit mechanic refused to accept that the old way was the only way, how he built something new in a dusty hangar with salvaged parts and determination, how he proved that American innovation, the willingness to think differently and take risks, could change the course of history. But the docents also tell them about the Penatiton, about 5 American airmen who died testing that innovation, about 5,700 Japanese soldiers and sailors who drowned or burned in 15 minutes of mechanical fury. Because that is the full truth of the Bismarck Sea. Innovation won the battle, but war killed the men. And we must remember both if we hope to learn anything at all. The Bismarck Sea is calm now. The water is blue and clear. Tourists swim in it. Fishermen cast their nets. Children play on the beaches. But 300 feet down in the cold darkness, the evidence remains. 16 ships, 5,700 souls. 15 minutes, that changed everything. And the lesson carved into twisted steel and coral-covered guns remains the same. The future belongs not to those who cling to the past, but to those who dare to imagine a different way forward. Paul Garrison understood that. Admiral Kurosawa learned it too late. And we standing here in 2025, watching new technologies reshape our world at an ever-increasing pace, would do well to remember both men. The innovator who changed warfare, and the traditionalist who paid the price for refusing to change. Because the next great innovation is being built right now, somewhere by someone who refuses to accept that the current way is the only way. And God help us all if we are too slow to adapt to what comes next. That is the legacy of the Bismarck Sea. That is the lesson written in Fire and Oil on March 3, 1943. And that lesson remains as true today as it was 82 years ago when a Detroit mechanic pressed a trigger and changed the world forever.